Well, thanks. It is a privilege to have a chance to chat with you today. I still sort of like pinch myself and say, what's a former CEO turned basketball junkie doing in front of a bunch of policymakers and not talking about technology? But I'll share some thoughts with you and hopefully pique some of your interest. When I retired from Microsoft in 2014, my wife grabbed me immediately and said, okay, man, it's time. You've got to help me now with our philanthropic stuff. She had been focused on foster care issues, largely in Washington State where we live, and she said, it's time to ramp up. You know, we've been blessed with a lot, and it's time to make a difference. And we kind of knew, or she kind of knew, the focus for us would be on kids who were born into disadvantaged circumstances where their probability of moving up economically was low. You could say they're kids who were born without the American dream. And my response to my wife was, don't worry about it. Government takes care of this problem. Government puts money up for all of these programs. There's really not much for philanthropy to do, because in the grand scale of the amount of money that gets spent, philanthropy is just a drop in the bucket. So let's happily pay our taxes and feel good about it and make our contribution. To which she said, what? Come on, we could do better than that. Come on, are you nuts? And so I said, okay, I'll do it. But secretly in the back of my mind, I still said to myself, government really does all this stuff. Government pays for it. I actually came to D.C. and I was kind of trying to learn outside the Microsoft context, and had a chance to sit down with a number of legislators, and I sat down with two senators from the same state, and I made my bold assertion about no reason to do philanthropy, give to government, and they looked at me, and their eyes bugged big out of their heads, and they said, you want to give your money to the government? You can certainly do better than that. And at that point, I had actually two things in my mind. Number one, I really was going to get to the bottom of whether I was right about where government money goes. And number two, if we don't believe that our government's going to solve many problems, we have to understand why. And if it's something that can be addressed, let's really get after it and address it. So I said, okay, I got to learn where these numbers come from. Where do they go? How much does government raise? Who do they raise it from? What do they spend it on? Does anything good happen? When I worked at Microsoft, we did this thing one time where we handed everybody a personalized benefit statement. This is what you got. The company's taking care of you. And I said, what would you send a citizen that explained to them what their benefits are? Stalk the internet. Look for the data. And the truth is, there's more data out there, as many of you know, than there's ever been before. And it is more incoherent than it's ever been before. You can find numbers isolated. It's the kind of thing I think politicians do. They don't really put things together in a coherent form. They'll grab a number that somebody mentioned to them, and they'll blurt it out as if it's the only important number going. I stepped back and said, how would we want to attack this problem? And I said that for me, the sensible way was to look at it through the same kind of, where did I go there? Back. The same kind of lens that a business person would look at their business. Structured numbers, organized, a context, so that everybody in the company can understand those numbers, drive against them, measure, get understanding and analysis. That meant a certain set of things to me, but at the end of the day, companies also have to report to external parties. They report through shareholder meetings, annual reports, and the granddaddy of them all, the 10K. The SEC drives these 10Ks. They have to be rigorous. They have to be absolutely correct, factual. They can show no bias. Your 10K can't say, well, we missed our, we're going to do better next year. No, the SEC shuts that down. just the facts, just tell us the history. They have to be comprehensive. It's not like you can say, well, we're going to tell you about the part of the business that's going well, but we're going to skip other things. They have to be contextual. An SEC report contains history. It shows how all the numbers roll up into a common place, and a 10K has to be comprehensive and contextual. So that was sort of the set of criteria that I started out with. Many of these things, and which to me meant we only use government numbers. We're not using forecasts, we're not using estimates, we're not using money or numbers that come from, this research institute. No, a business has to use its own numbers. And government should use its own numbers. And government decision makers should work off government numbers. Otherwise, fire everybody and get the numbers right. It's impossible to do better than that. The toughest challenge is, what is the logical structure of government? Businesses have to organize themselves into lines of business. They're called segments. What are the lines of business of government? What is the mission of government? How do you think about that? After a while, it became clear to us, we just turned to the preamble of the Constitution. It lays out the mission of government: to establish justice and ensure domestic tranquility, to provide for the common defense, to promote the general welfare, and the last one I always have to remember, secure the blessing of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. That's the mission of government. Those are the logical pieces to government. And then in each of these areas, just like a business, you could say, what are the key subsegments? Well, justice. There's physical problems, crime and disaster. There's commercial problems, consumer and employee safeguards. And then children need to be protected, if you will, from their parents. And you can go through and see the 4 big segments and the things that we categorized. This is, to me, a logical view of government. It's not organized like departments, cabinet departments. It's not organized like Senate or House committees. I will point out to you that all 3 of those things are organized differently. It is not organized by the categories in the budget. One that we had hoped for a while was to organize by political platforms. The problem is the 2 parties have different ones and they change all the time. These segments have to be consistent. So this is where we went. We went to the Constitution. This is the way for us to organize and present these numbers. Here's a little video describing what we did.
USAFacts is proud to present our latest 10K and annual report for government. A 10K is a document that publicly traded companies must file each year with the SEC. It gives an accurate, unembellished overview of their financial performance. We use this same format for government in the U.S. to give a factual, unbiased, historical, and contextual view of the state of our country. Each line item is available in up to 3 formats. First, let's explore the interactive report for properties. Here, we can see how much land the federal government owns, which agency manages it, and how it breaks down by state. Down here in map view, we can instantly visualize the data. Acres currently owned are here. Changes in acres owned, here. Second, let's explore the PDF report for management, analysis, and discussion. Here we are, expenditures by segment. We can see total spending, and federal, state, and local spending, how it's changed, and how it tracks with the core missions of the U.S. Constitution. Third, embedded in these reports is this interactive analysis. In this one, we can compare and contrast the latest data across multiple years, adjust for inflation and population, and more. Equally informative is this year's annual report. It's a simplified, more visual version of the information described in the 10K, shown through hundreds of vibrant charts and graphs. Let's glance at a few of the data sets, like where the government's revenue comes from, trends in crime, and what the average family earns and pays in taxes each year. Most of these figures are dynamic, meaning one click, and they link back to their respective source on the USAFacts website. The USAFacts Annual Report, the USAFacts 10K Report. Explore our nation in numbers.
Just to give you a small sense, you can go to www.usafacts.org if you want to get the report and take a look. I'm proud enough of the work that I'd recommend that you do it because it is really a comprehensive look at government by the numbers. Let me give you just some context. All of this is up on the site, but some things that are interesting. Top-level presentation. Where does government revenue come from, and where does it get spent? How big is corporate? You can see tax revenue, non-tax revenue. Before I started this, I didn't actually realize that non-tax revenue is as big as it is. A lot of that is gains on the portfolios of state and local government. And this does not include fees, the way the government does its accounting. Revenue, for example, taken in to visit a national park is offset by the cost of the national park and doesn't actually show in revenue. Okay, interesting learning. These go down multiple layers, but I'll pick one, corporate income tax. With the last tax overhaul, a lot is made of corporate income tax, and certainly everybody can decide whether it's big or small, but at least as a percentage, if you go up, it's the third thing from the top on the far left, it is a smaller percentage of the total than at least I had in mind when I started. I would have said corporate income taxes are bigger. The other thing which we do when you get to the analysis by individual is you recognize that corporate entities don't really pay taxes for themselves. They pay taxes on behalf of their shareholders. So in a sense, that is a tax by and large on pension funds and people's pensions, as well as the most affluent people in the country. Similarly, on expenses, you can see how we're organized by segment and then the detailed spending below. We treat both Social Security and Medicare as savings programs, because that's really what they both are. You put money in, you take money back out. One's like a health savings account, the other's simply like a place to, like a regular savings account. So we put those under the topic of securing these blessings for ourselves and our liberty, just to give you an example. A couple things that are surprising. I think when I went into this, I probably expected government to be not mostly, but a lot of bureaucrats. You know, if you would read the popular press or listen to the blah, 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 blah of many people, what you would conclude is government's full of bureaucrats. You take a look at this, there's over 23 million people employed by government in the U.S. What's the biggest block at the top at almost half? Teachers and other people who work in schools. That would include universities as well as K through 12. Health and hospitals. These are public health inspectors. These are people who work in government hospitals. How many people get treated in government hospitals? I do. I go to the University of Washington Hospital. Everybody who works there is actually a government worker. You can keep going. General government and other. That's finance and administration, in addition to some bureaucrats. But if you take a look at 1.6 million divided by 23 million, you get about 6.5%, call it 7% in overhead and bureaucrats. Most companies run 4 or 5%. Not significantly different than you would find in most companies. Active duty military, not bureaucrats. Police, not bureaucrats. Highway and transportation, not bureaucrats. Corrections, not bureaucrats. National defense, not bureaucrats. And you keep going down the list from the top, and the first thing I concluded is, wow, the shape of government employment is quite different. I think the federal government, counting the military, is about 4 million of this. And I think military, active duty plus civilian, is half of the federal number, just to give you a sense of size and scale. GDP, a lot gets talked about. I watch CNBC. I'm one of those folks who has it on when I'm on the elliptical machine in the morning. and you say, boy, these people love to talk about GDP. Understanding GDP turns out to take a little bit of time, just a couple minutes. As a business person, I don't want to hear economic analysis, yick, 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 too complicated for me, too subject to what shall I say, partisan views. We're completely nonpartisan. After all, adjectives are partisan. Numbers are just what they are. They're not. In a world of fake news and alternate facts, numbers are numbers. They come from government. They're about the history. They speak for themselves. Back to GDP. How do you make GDP grow? Well, a business would do cost accounting on something like this. It is a number of units times dollar per unit. GDP is GDP per person growth times inflation. That would be, sort of future dollars compared to existing dollars, times number of people. Okay, the productivity measure in there, the secret sauce of innovation in America, what's happened to GDP per person growth? Well, it was going up like this, accelerating growth in GDP per person. And now that has, at least as God, these things keep flipping. Yeah, trended change in red. You can see that the GDP per person growth is actually sloping down. So when a politician gets up and says, yes, we're going to do everything with GDP growth, which you tend to hear, frankly, from both parties in their own context, it's a little hard to believe. That means there's two ways to grow GDP. Inflation, I think most people say, oh, inflation bad, we don't want to become a banana republic. So that leaves you with population growth. Population growth in the United States is about 2 million people a year. Half of population growth comes from the fact that births exceed deaths. Half comes from immigration. So if you want GDP to grow, those are your variables. You can drive up inflation, you can drive up productivity, which has not been at an accelerating pace, or you can drive up population, which is primarily an immigration matter. And of course, paying the national debt and our future obligations depends heavily on growth in GDP. You can do the thinking, everybody can have a different analysis of this, but this is kind of what the numbers say. And we're at a record percentage of the working age population that's working. What does all this mean? I'm not trying to give a tutorial on this particular topic. It's the kind of thing that if you look at it through the numbers, as opposed to the principles, you can just say to yourself, do I believe, as a regular old person, not an economist, what do I believe about what might happen with GDP? And our goal is to make these numbers understandable enough for that purpose. Not to tell you what's going to happen, but to let you assess. My wife and I used this chart. Remember where I told you, I said government solves all the questions of poverty and opportunity? My wife said, no, it doesn't. Well, the truth we've learned through our philanthropy is government does provide most of the money, and philanthropy and community partnership actually steers the money. If you look at that, there's about $1.3 trillion of money that gets allocated to support poor kids and their families. 1.3 trillion out of a total government budget of $5.7 trillion. And if you take out Social Security and Medicare, it's quite, I think it's off the top of my head, I remember 33 or 40%. We don't make a negligible investment in kids who need opportunity. This is another usage point. We have the data. How does that Medicaid money get used? And now the question is, how do we get the numbers that let people dive into this? A lot is made of family income, the hollowing out of the middle class. I did not understand when people said the hollowing out of the middle class. I'm still not sure I understand what the word middle class means. But the numbers do allow us to do some analysis. What we have here is 3 rows. One for the poorest 20% of people in the country, one that's for the middle 20%, and one that is for the top 20%. We have total it's a busy slide, there's much of interest, but we took it right as a concept from the report. You can go over to total income. Let's go to the middle, and you can look at the blue and the red. Blue is from 2000, red's from today. Okay? Makes sense? It took $67,000, it took $38,000 to get into the middle 20%. That shocked me by itself. 40% of the people are under $38,000 a year of income. But when you progress through to 2016, it only takes $33,000 to get into the middle 20%. It is true, the middle income is shrinking. This is all inflation adjusted. It is shrinking. Now I understand what the hollowing out of the middle class means. By the numbers. I understand that. I can explain it, not just as a bunch of blah, 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 and then Feldstein says this, and then somebody else says that. The numbers, at least in my own case, and anybody who barely likes numbers, the numbers can set you free. It's 38,000 goes to 38,000 goes to 31,000. That's what it takes now to be in the middle class. Education. Education spending is up dramatically. Over the course of 1998 to today, education spending per kid, inflation adjusted, is up from $10,000 to $12,000. You take a look at the high school graduation rate, it's up. Sounds good. We have more teachers per student. That's why the education spend is up. Most people think student-teacher ratios are going the wrong way. They're going the right way from a lot of people's perspective. And yet, with all of that spending and with all that improved graduation rate, the increase in reading and math proficiency for 8th graders is largely flat, and it's largely flat around 33%. Only 33% of 8th graders are proficient in math and reading, and yet we're graduating now, 82% and spending a ton more on education. Everybody can draw their own judgment. Is it good that we're spending more? Is it bad? Is it getting us the outcomes we want? This is what it looks like, if you will, by the numbers. Crime. With our focus on kids looking for opportunity, one thing you'll find is a lot of poor kids grow up in families in which people are incarcerated. What's the profile? How does that look? We can show you here incarceration rates, which rose and are now falling. Arrest rate for drug abuse is probably the primary driver of the fall. So with drug reform, you can decide whether you're for or against drug reform, we will see some decline. Now, I'll remind you, the surge in drug arrests came with the crack epidemic, and we are now facing an opioid epidemic. What will people feel about drug arrests and drug crime with the rise of opioids? Will people want to use mental health solutions? Will we invest? All good questions. But let's make those judgments in the perspective of the numbers. One thing we get hit on a lot is too many people are incarcerated. Well, part of that is drug crime, but part of that actually is violent crime. What is the average number of months that a violent criminal serves in prison? Violent crime is rape, murder, aggravated assault, manslaughter, robbery, armed robbery. Okay, those are the five things that are violent crime. Well, the average violent criminal who doesn't die in prison, because there'll be some who die, serves 4.2 years, 50 months. I looked at that and said, whoa, that surprises me. That's an average of people who beat you up, people who rob you at gunpoint, people who kill you, and people who rape women. 4.2 years? I was surprised. If society decided we had to incarcerate violent felons for a longer period of time, of course, the incarceration rate would again increase. I make no judgment because USAFacts is not a partisan organization, but I think people can make judgments and see how they feel about these topics. I'll show you one more. This is work that an economist named Raj Chetty has done, but it's just a representation of government numbers. He has a proprietary access to tax records because he's under contract with the IRS, and he mixes and matches those with census records and then does an analysis. What percentage of kids born in the bottom 20%, for example, wind up in the bottom, the middle, the top, etc. You can see you get about 3 times as many kids in the bottom staying in the bottom as move to the top. That's white kids. If you look at the same number for black kids, it's over 10 times as many stay in the bottom 20% versus move up. Now, in our own case, on this issue, I am partisan. I don't think that's okay. I think the percentage of kids who move up in a community should be higher. Otherwise, the American dream just dissipates. So for me, this makes a dramatic statement in terms of how I think about other things that I do in my life. Again, the numbers in this case set us free. Now, what we figured out, my wife and I'll footnote this for you since I have a minute, is philanthropy does have a role. Government funds programs. Government doesn't take accountability for solutions. A kid in school who's not performing, is the problem the school? To some degree. But to an even bigger degree, it may be issues in the community which make it impossible for that kid to get anything done. And so, again, the numbers will serve to set us free, but then philanthropy has to fill in around the edges for the things that government programs don't fund and to stitch things together across communities. So for all of the reasons I got started working with my wife, I now am back full circle on both parts. She's right, philanthropy matters, and I'm right, government mostly pays for these things. I hope some of this made some sense and wet your whistle. We certainly have a lot of work to do. If you go to our site and do a search doesn't work as well as it needs to because searching these things is a complicated issue. We work with our partners at Wharton on the back end. We're all hard at work on what does it mean to make search work better. Government data is not always timely or accessible, or frankly, it doesn't always agree with itself. If you look at state and local spending, the way the states report it versus the way the federal government reports, whoops, doesn't match. Now, I don't think anybody's doing a bad job. I think everybody's trying to do their best, but there's not enough pressure in the system, despite the Data Act, to put these things together. How does anybody make a decision with data which sometimes doesn't reconcile and isn't out on a timely basis? State and local data is much messier than any data that's collected by the federal government. Much messier. We are hell-bent and determined to provide state and local data, but it is very, very difficult. We're working on that. And ultimately, what we would hope to do is have a body of data that people can use in decision-making. In my dream of dreams, we'll be out of business in 10 years. In my dream of dream, government will produce its own 10K, an annual report. In my dream of dreams, every legislator someday will have to sign, just like a CEO does, that they've read the numbers and that they're accurate. Every legislator and elected executive branch official will have to sign and said, yes, I believe in these numbers. And then people can't bicker about what happened. You can bicker about what you want to do about it, but do not bicker and do not bring your own numbers. I think it was Moynihan who said, we can all disagree about what to do, but we shouldn't disagree about what the facts are. The facts are the facts. And what we're trying to do is in the most if you will, neutral way through numbers, to explain where the country is and bring them together. Ultimately, government should do that job for itself. Every stack of government data is in its own silo. I love the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I love the census. I love what Treasury does. I love what all of these agencies does. Can we get one group in government that's actually chartered with bringing the numbers together in a coherent form? I hope so. In the meantime, we'll keep slogging away and hopefully give you a resource that you can use as you do your jobs and as the people that you work for go forward on their work. Thank you very much, and as Andy and I do some Q&A, we'll look forward to that. It's been a pleasure, and if you promise not to give it out, I'd be also happy after the fact to entertain questions or suggestions. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. While we'll get these chairs moved over here, we can do it ourselves. You know, they talk about. No, I got it.
You got
I got this one. Okay. Excuse us.
Andy says we can do it, and then he doesn't, I don't.
Well, you got it taken away from you. Anyway, Steve, thank you very much for that highly informative, interesting, and not surprisingly energetic presentation. It's really pretty incredible what you're doing, I think, and it's very singular. You know, as you were saying, you know, when you were talking about how you came up with the idea with your wife, and you think about all the things that people in your position are doing. I mean, I can't think of anybody who's doing anything even remotely like what you're doing. So kudos to you for that.
Thank you
very
very
interesting.
much.
I guess so what's going to happen here is Kent said, I'm going to ask some questions. We've got some questions from the audience, and you guys can continue to think up questions. I think there are going to be people coming around if anything occurs to you while we're talking. We're going to talk about USAFacts. I may ask a question or two about basketball, maybe a question or two about the tech sector, but mostly we'll talk about what's going on here today. Just to start off, Steve, you talked a lot about the genesis of this idea, but I just want to clarify a little bit more. What problem are you really trying to solve here? Is it that individuals don't understand their government, or it's that regulators and lawmakers need to get a better grip on things, or is it both?
I would say I would not, well, in a way you could say I started this project as a hobby. And when we first launched our first product 2 years ago, I had no clue whether anybody would really be interested. And I was surprised. I mean, we got a little extra boost from, you know, fake news and alternate facts, I will say. It was a good environment for this product to launch. And I said, okay, we're going to really take this on and be serious. I worked at Microsoft. Microsoft builds products for the masses. I didn't want to build a product that was only going to be used by a small group of, if you will, specialists. So we're building a product that should be rich enough to support people who want to be in great depth, but we can put that information together in a way that brings these things alive to what I would call at least the percentage of citizenry that wants to be informed. That's not everybody, and is, you know, if not comfortable with numbers, at least comfortable with graphs. One of the toughest things actually we have is people who are not comfortable with big numbers. You say 1 million to most people, they say big number. You say 1 billion, they say big number. If you remind them that 1 trillion is 1,000 billions, and that 1 trillion is 1 million millions. Oh, what does that mean? The numbers are too big to comprehend. So we will work on issues like that to make this accessible to the citizenry that wants to get informed, and yet the database, the thing we're building with Wharton and the tools, they'll be rich enough to do essentially any level of analysis that folks in this room might want to do.
One of the big conundrums in the media today, being a media person, is getting it out there. You know, in space, no one can hear you scream. You've got this great set of data. You've got USAFacts.org. How do you get the word out? How do you push the message, the information, the media out to people?
I think we have been modestly successful so far, and most of it's been stimulated, frankly, by the fact that people are a little curious about why I did this thing, and so you get a little bit of a bootstrap. That's not going to be enough, and we're hard at work. We actually just today announced that we've hired Poppy McDonald, who was president and COO of Politico, is going to come join us to work both on developing the product and helping put it in a form that'll reach more and more people.
Where are you located, and how many people work at this endeavor?
We are in our offices in just outside Seattle, Washington.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it turns out you could be almost anywhere.
Right.
The numbers are in the internet, so it doesn't mean you have to be in D.C. or. We do not ask government for their help with anything. Why would we? We only want to use publicly available data. Although I will say I had a real charge out of meeting the Comptroller General, numbers lovers over there at GAO, and I got a chance to speak at the National Association of State and Local Government Auditors. That was a great, fun thing for at least me. Might not be everybody's cup of tea, but where was I going? I lost my thread.
Well, just the people working there.
Oh, so how many people
Yeah.
do we have working? We have 4 full-time. We have a number of contractors who actually wrote the 10K, produced the annual report. That's probably another 4 or 5 contractors. We have a decent-sized team at Wharton, which does a lot of the work, and then another decent-sized team that we contract for the web design. This is not something that would, if the government want to do it, we're not talking about another 5,000 people to pull this kind of stuff together.
And without getting into the budget necessarily, I don't know if you want to reveal that, but it doesn't sound like it's something that's draining your personal coffers particularly. I mean, it's something you're funding on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, I fund it all myself. We don't try to make revenue. That might have bias. So we don't do that. We're running now single-digit millions a year, and we know we're going to need to increase that budget, but I don't think, and I've been fortunate enough, we can fund it. It's a lot of money, but again, if you do 1,000 millions, a billion, it's not. Anyway, let me leave it there. It is fundable and affordable by me.
Right. I want to talk about this notion of bias, because that's really interesting to me, because it's just, and you mentioned also, you know, that this era that we're living in with fake news and what's true and all that, it's very hard to be unbiased, Steve, right? And inevitably, don't things become political? I remember at one point I was looking at, you was talking about foreign aid, and foreign aid, as it turns out, it's a really small number compared to the overall budget. But if you had a political lens on it, you could still say, but that's still a lot of money. So how do you avoid that political bias?
Well, that's okay. People are allowed to have their opinion. The only thing you don't want to do is take it out of context. You want to hold people accountable. You say, okay, I can't remember off the top of my head. Let's say that number's about 40 billion. Okay, 40 billion out of 5.7 trillion. That is what it is. And you could say, hey, look, we should go get a couple billion out of there. We should leave it alone. But you might want to drill in and take a look that almost 40% of foreign aid is actually spent helping military allies and partners. It goes into Afghanistan. It goes into Iraq. You take a look at that and say, oh, that's not what I think about as foreign aid, but Israel is one of the biggest beneficiaries of this country when it comes to foreign aid. Surprised me, I will say. So you take a look at all that and say how much is really going to support countries in, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, which is where I think most people think our foreign aid budget would go in large measure. Now you're down to a number that is several single digits of billions. And you can decide whether that's too much or too little. I mean, it's a rounding error in the defense budget, for example.
Right. And I just saw a number of things up there that, you know, could be seized upon by politicians. That one where more people are working. And, you know, you could see someone on either side of the aisle going, see, or not, and then someone trying to debunk that. But that, you know, you have to acknowledge that a fact is a fact, the Daniel Patrick Moynihan thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, it is. It's 69% of people of working age are actually working. You could say, oh, well, we're going to get to 75 or 80. Well, 69 is the highest it's ever been. Or you could say one of the big boons that drove that is the higher number of women who are now in the workforce. And everybody can have a different perspective on what's right or wrong. But if somebody said to me 69 is going to go to 80, if somebody made that assertion to me and I looked at the trend line, I'd fall out of my chair laughing.
Yeah. I mean, that number surprised me, and then it runs counter to this whole thing of this, huge unemployed class of people that we have that you keep hearing about, right?
Unemployment's also, it turns out it's a very synthetic number. It's an estimate, which is why labor participation rate is an actual. I'll give you another one of my favorite. You know how we talk about life expectancy? Life expectancy is actually a forecast. The average age at which people die, that's an actual. Turns out the average age at which people die is about 72 point whatever, 4 or 5 years. Maybe it's 73.5 now, and it's only in the last 15 years it's come up from 72.5. The benefit in terms of average age of death for the dramatic increase in healthcare spend is not very much, particularly if you do the isolation of smoking as a numerical factor. And somebody could decide, hey, look, it's my loved one, let's spend all the money. I certainly would do that for my loved ones. But again, the numbers are interesting, but they don't tell you what to think. They do let you call somebody out for misrepresenting the situation.
I love how you have all those numbers at your disposal. I mean, it seems like it's a real passion of yours, right? I mean, you really, he's good. By the way, I think you got an 800 on your math SAT.
Actually, no, I got a 790. Wikipedia's wrong on that.
Is that right? See,
to be fair.
This is a problem with Wikipedia. That's actually.
But I want to establish my real street cred on this. I went to a math camp one summer.
Oh, yeah.
You don't find a lot of math campers standing around.
Yeah. Great stuff. Why don't we go to some questions, because they're starting to build up here from the audience, and this one is actually one that I had, which is, do you see a government office or agency capable of executing your plan, or should one be created? Or, to follow up on this question, why don't they just turn over the whole damn thing to you? I mean, the census, for instance, why don't you do it?
Yeah, no, I think we'll pass on that. For a lot of reasons, you want people to know that stuff is of highest integrity. And if people don't think government produces things of the highest integrity, including whoever the leaders themselves are, then damn it, fix it. If you're a business and your numbers aren't good, you have to fix it. So, no, we would never, choose to produce those numbers ourselves. Where could government choose to do that work? Certainly, if they were chartered, you could do it in the GAO. GAO now doesn't have a reporting function. It primarily, although they do reporting, they're primarily oriented towards audit on behalf of the legislature. You could say, let's do it in OMB, but OMB has huge turnover and has a fundamental political appointee. The GAO thing is beautiful, by the way. This Controller General post, it amazed me when I learned about it. It's a 10-year term. The next Controller General will be proposed by both houses of Congress, and you will have Democrats and Republicans recommend a candidate, 2 or 3 of them, to the president. The president picks one. The term is 10 years, and the only way you can throw a Controller General out of office is same impeachment process as the president. Now, if you want integrity in numbers, that's a way to do it. You remove the number gathering and publication process from the political process, and you give people the time, like a 10-year horizon, to do that job well. You do it in a bipartisan way. You know, people say the Census Bureau is going to cook the numbers, or they're not. That's terrible. It is terrible that can be a discussion, a political discussion. And I think those kinds of things should be isolated from the political process through something much akin to what goes on at GAO today.
All right, here's another one from the audience, Steve. Do you see the current budget cuts reducing the quality of government data? The
quality of government data is to me a lot about timeliness and double checking numbers across agencies. There's nobody chartered right now with assembling the numbers and checking things against each other. And there apparently is no pressure from the Congress to get numbers on a timely basis. So, unless you're going to get after those issues, I think you're in a non-starter. Now you could say, hey, look, do we need more resources in the Census Bureau or not? I don't know. I mean, this is just like working at Microsoft. More money in a function doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get better work. Maybe you need more automation. Maybe you need fewer people and more automation. Maybe you'd get a better result. I certainly found that. So I'm not arguing one way or the other, but I think the general prevailing sentiment that says if we just had more, our numbers would be better, I don't buy that. I don't think that's necessarily the case.
Okay. Does USAFacts explicitly consider the impact of law legislation? Example, cost of Obamacare. If yes, then how?
Okay. How much do we really know about the cost of the ACA, to use a less political word?
Yes.
What do we really know about the cost of the ACA? Not really that very much. The numbers aren't timely enough to really have a lot of good data for decision making. I can't remember. Maybe we've got 1 year of numbers, maybe 2 that the government has rolled up and consolidated and are in an analyzable form. Can you really now model what's happened to emergency room visits? What's happened to, what do they call it? Free care at hospitals. How have all these things moved? The truth of the matter is the numbers are not timely enough to do a good analysis. Would we publish that as an integrated analysis if the numbers were timely? The answer is yes. The immigration data, we have a new part of the site up that gives you the history of immigration going back many decades. How did policy changes? How did population change? How did immigration change? But is that really going to look at the last year or two? No. The last year, it's just not current. The government numbers need to be more current. And I think in that case, you can argue the answer's got to be automation. It just can't be more human beings.
Right. That doesn't sound like it's necessarily going to happen over the next 6 months, does it?
No. These are decisions that will be made with old data. On the other hand, there are interesting facts. The U.S. population grows by about 2 million people a year. Half, I think I said this, half are from immigration, half are from births exceeding deaths. Interesting fact.
Yeah.
I think off the top of my head about 11, 12, 13% of the U.S. population is foreign born. That's been consistent pretty much for decades. That number is not dramatically up or down. The movement of border apprehensions are dramatically down. Border Patrol agents are dramatically up. Is one the cause of the other? Who knows? Maybe, maybe not. But you can at least look at a bunch of data and say, does the current debate, is it well grounded in the numbers? Where do most immigrants come from? Family members of existing people living,
not citizens necessarily,
could
but
be
people
on
living in the
a
United
proper
States.
visa,
Right.
but then, certainly you can hear that argued in the press. It's a bad thing, and then you get terms that are pejorative, or it's a good thing, and then you get terms that are not. But at least people should understand the perspective there.
This is a good one. Are there government numbers you don't trust? Are you concerned that at some point in the future there will be government numbers you don't trust?
I trust that we have high integrity, honest people doing their best work. I don't trust that the government is well structured to put those things together in a professional way. I hope the Data Act eventually goes farther, for example. I think there ought to be an agency that is required, or part of some agency, to put the numbers together and make sure they tick and tie. Even businesses, if they're not careful, will get numbers that come from different sources and don't match each other. So I believe we have a high integrity government that is people in our government that's doing a good job. I believe the process is not well organized and well structured. I think that's more of a management challenge than anything else. I worry, as I said earlier, about the timeliness of the data. Do I worry about whether politicians will muck with the data, which was kind of part of it? I guess I don't worry about that really being today's problem. But as I said, I prefer the structure of GAO, because then I think you can tell the population, no politicians cooking the books. And number two, then you'd have a professional organization, well managed, that can take a long-term perspective on the numbers.
And so you said you don't work with the government at all.
No,
I mean,
we reached out. I mean, we have reached out to some people in government. It turns out it's really hard to get some of the state and local stuff. So we had some interns from Stanford last summer poking around the internet to try to find, and they found actually some telephone numbers. And sometimes if you call the right person, the data exists, and you can get the data. And so it's not that it's not publicly available, it's just impossible to find. In fact, one of our interns called State Capitol in Olympia, Washington, and they said, yeah, you can have the data. Great. How do I get it? Well, you have to come into our offices physically, look at the data, and then leave. What the heck? Is this the year 2018 in a state that's the headquarters to Microsoft and Amazon? Woo! Pretty nutty in my perspective.
All right, someone seems to be taking issue with something. This is a kind of a real-time question, okay? You seem to be, Steve, a little naive. There's no evidence that BLS, census, BEA, et cetera, are subject to any political influence similar to GAO. You shouldn't imply otherwise. It's more of a statement than a question, but just thought I'd tell you.
I tried to be careful about that, and if I wasn't careful about that, I apologize. Mm-hmm. I said I believe in the integrity of the people who are doing the work. I said the management structure, these numbers do not tick and tie. They don't. If you look at numbers that come out of agencies, they don't match each other. Believe me, there's a nice man here called Richard Coffin who'll be happy to tell you about all the numbers that don't match. And I believe people are working with integrity. Does the American population believe people are working with integrity? Absolutely not. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this debate about people trying to cook the census. Therefore, I would say having something that by appearance is better from an integrity perspective would be a good thing. But if people think I cast aspersions on the people at BEA or BLS, I apologize to anybody who's here. I think these are wonderful people doing, as they say, God's work. And believe me, there's no USAFacts without great work at those agencies.
I hope that satisfies that comment that person made. How do you decide on how much metadata or context analysis to provide with your numbers?
Well, the metadata, context, and analysis are like three different things.
Okay,
so
yeah, true.
We are trying to provide the metadata basically in better and better forms. And that's something we work on. You need to have a taxonomy of the information. That's why we started out with these segments and cohorts of population, but that's how you'll do the best job with metadata. There has to be some kind of description, and it can get more detailed or not. At some point, the metadata gets so complicated, nobody will understand it. In terms of, it was metadata analysis, and what was the
context, I guess?
Context.
Yeah.
Context is something where I'm proud of what we've done. We provide a lot of context. Now, are there places where I might sometimes want to see three pieces of information on the same piece of paper that we do not put on the same part of the website? You have to pull it together yourself? The answer is absolutely yes. But we give you the tools, if you don't think we have the context you want, to bring in more numbers that are contextual. Analysis we will only do in the following sense. we might take at some point sets of numbers and show you what they would look like in 2 or 3 or 4 different cases. We would not tell you that we predict this, we forecast this, we absolutely say this caused this. That's beyond the scope of letting the numbers tell the story. Then you have to sort of believe that we have better economists or better something than everybody else, which I would think just can't be the case. So we won't do that kind of analysis.
Okay. A couple more, and then I'm going to switch over to some other topics like basketball and the world of tech a little bit. Okay. This person, it's kind of like from the home front here a little bit. Now that I have a small child at home, I've noticed that we all are really just little maximizers. We want our goodies and don't want to pay for stuff. How does your tool help people understand not just what government does, but the constraints it faces and the trade-offs that are necessary? For example, what if I want higher teacher salaries and smaller class sizes?
Okay, the numbers are actually there for you to, if you want to, run that scenario. I have run that very scenario. My wife loves to tell me teachers are highly underpaid, for example. So what do? First, you look at what is the average teacher pay? What percentage is teacher pay of total education is teacher pay? How much do teachers get paid beyond what's in their salaries? At Microsoft, I'll just tell you, benefits on an average employee would be about 25% maybe all in of the person's salary. On teachers, that number's about 50%. How do you want to factor in the fact that benefits are, and you work 9 months, how do you want to factor that in? People have to decide how to think about that, but we give you the numbers to increase and multiply. I think you have to use the fully burdened number as opposed to just the salary number. So you can do this. Let me give you an example. I think the average teacher in the U.S. makes, without benefits, I want to say that number is about $60,000, $55,000, right in there. And let's say you wanted to give every teacher a $20,000 pay increase, $20,000 or $10,000. It's got to be a meaningful number. This is sort of a silly discussion. $10,000 per teacher, if I remember right. There's about 3.5 million K through 12 teachers. That gets you to about, 300? 330 billion. No, it must be more like, yeah. Well, I better stop. My brain's a little soft from the red eye. But you can do those numbers. You multiply them out.
Right.
Let's say class sizes, I think over the last 25-ish years, student-teacher ratios have gone from about 16 to 12. If they were still 16 today, education spend would be about 30% less than it is. Education spends about $700 billion. So we have invested in student-teacher ratio about $200 billion, and we still have the educational outcomes we have. You decide whether that's been a good thing. You decide whether putting more money in. Recently, my wife and I have been looking at early childhood education. That's kind of like adding a new grade or two. So you add a new grade or two, that's like 2/13 of 700 billion. And it turns out if you really want to do what they call quality pre-K, teachers get paid less than other teachers. You'd put them up to regular teacher salary, and class sizes are always smaller in pre-K than they would be in regular. You'd wind up adding, if I did the math right, about 150 billion if you wanted to do universal pre-K, unless then you want to start only doing that by scholarshiping some people. Anyway, all the data is there to do this kind of analysis on the site and then assess whether you want to make the trade-off. Somebody's going to say, let's cut something else. Somebody else is going to say, increase the deficit. Now, on that issue, I will admit I am partisan. I'm a business person. I don't understand the concept of not balancing the budget. I would say both parties seem to have a way to not balance it. One likes to cut taxes. One likes to increase expenses. That is a nonpartisan view. My own opinion is, frankly, I don't care whether we increase revenue, decrease expenses, or some combination. The democratic process should determine that, but I hope over time we manage to balance the budget.
Fair enough. I didn't realize you took the red eye. You're looking pretty good, I got to say. But I guess it makes sense given what you were doing last night, right, which is the NBA draft. We'll get to that in 1 second, because I want to ask you about the tech sector, Microsoft just a little bit. Tech sector. For years, the tech sector was driving the economy, still driving the economy, but they could do no wrong. Now there appears to be a backlash against tech for various reasons, privacy, hacking, et cetera, et cetera. How do you think this is going to play out, Steve?
Well, I'm not trying to do a woe is me thing, but remember we got hit by an antitrust lawsuit at Microsoft by the DOJ. This government stuff should be, it's serious stuff. And knowing what I know now, I would have resolved the issues. Whether I thought, at the time I did not think we were in any way monopolists, my opinion. I thought that was a condemnation of our behavior. But if you ask me now, I think we should have figured out how to settle matters out earlier than we did. I do not think it was helpful for our company, the path we took. I think the tech industry right now could well repeat that experience. I think fully accepting that things are not the way they need to be and going to work on those issues in a way that people believe you are serious about, as opposed to the tech industry generally appearing arrogant. I understand that. I also think it's important that it be clear where and what kind of direction will come, because there are issues which tech companies, somebody's got to decide what's okay and what's not okay. I don't think that should be Congress. I do think it should probably, in general, be one of the regulatory agencies. They can dig in, they can understand this stuff, they can keep it out of the political realm by and large. But when it comes to privacy, we used to go through this privacy on the browser. They are super complicated issues with deep technology. What do people mean? What do they want? How to think about it? Is there fake news on Facebook? Of course there is. I could go right now on Facebook and say there's an earthquake, Richter scale 7 in Washington, D.C. And should I be allowed to do that? Or should that be something that somehow Facebook has a way to control? I don't know. I get how Facebook could control advertising. I don't get how their value proposition, which the world does like, I don't understand how it works at all if you have no freedom of speech, even if you're saying things that are patently false online.
It gets towards yelling, fire in a crowded theater. It's where does freedom of speech end?
Yeah.
That's a timeless question.
Yeah.
Right. Interesting perspective there. So let me ask you about Microsoft. You stepped down as CEO in 2014. Satya Nadella has taken the reins and seems to be doing quite well. What's he done right? What's he doing right there at Microsoft?
Well, let's start with the fact that the stock price is up about a factor of 3, and it's the largest shareholder in Microsoft. I'm okay with that. Let's start there. Now, look, I kind of understand enough to be dangerous, and yet I'm 4 years out of date. I told Satya actually when he took over, don't listen to old CEOs after about a year. You get incredibly out of date. And I mean that about me, and I mean that about Bill. You get out of date. It's just not the same. So I am out of date. What I would say is I see some things that I think are good and some things that I feed back to Satya that, I would like to see the company do differently, but I trust that he's making the right decisions. The thing that has certainly been most notable is while we had started the cloud stuff 10 plus years ago, it seems to be really humming. Now, are there things underneath there? I'm always, as a shareholder, wanted to crawl in, but I think you could say net, doing a great job. On the consumer side of the business, Xbox doing well. Some of the other areas, hey, maybe you could go further. I've been interviewing basketball players recently. These are basically young men between the age of 18 and 21. That's an old person to be interviewing in this job. And I'll tell you, Microsoft, yeah, they've kind of heard of the company. Xbox? Everybody's an Xbox. Well, one kid actually told me, Xbox, nah, PlayStation's much better. Thank God most of the rest of the guys have Xboxes. It sort of warmed the cockles of my heart.
Interesting. And, the power of those consumer brands inside a big company and letting them run free like that. I mean, and my understanding is that's what they've done with LinkedIn so far, is Microsoft bought LinkedIn, letting that thing run.
Those are tricky things. If you buy something and you just let it run free, you wonder where was the synergy that was supposed to drive the value that you promised shareholders. And yet if you don't let it run free and you just suck the life out of it. So I think those are all sort of, you have to decide where you are. And I think so far management seems
with us if you're not, because he's passionately interested in this.
I am.
What did you guys need? Who did you draft? How did it work out?
Well, I would say
I'm sorry to interrupt. What is it like? What I really want to know also is what is it like for an owner the night of the draft? What do you do?
Well, let me say, I've owned the team for 4 years. We've only had one first-round draft pick the whole time I've been there, and we certainly have not had a high draft pick, and we had 2 last night. So I'm like a kid in the can. Whoa, we got to really get up to speed on this stuff. So I literally participated in interviews with probably 25 young men. We have people who are far more expert than me than saying this guy can run, this guy can jump, this guy plays angles, blah, blah, blah. We have a great guy running our front office, and we have Jerry West, who some of you may have heard of, basketball icon as an advisor. But I have my thing I care about. Are these guys who continuously improve? Are these guys who work hard? Are these guys of high integrity? You can, in the sense that if they say they're going to do something, they're going to do it. The medical reports, some of the medical reports on these guys are very, very scary in terms of their ability to keep playing. So for me, just doing that part and meeting these young men was cool as heck. Just cool as heck. I have to say, just full stop, period. But then, the machinations, who do you get? Who's going to pick who higher? Can you trade up? Ooh, did your guy get through to you? Woo! And we were delighted. Then you call the young men and, yeah, you guys are when we met these guys and we've had dinner with these guys and, we're all pumped up. They're pumped up, which is kind of fun. We'll have a big dinner to welcome them on Sunday, press conference on Monday. And what do you draft for, at least in my opinion? A rookie who you draft, you can keep if you want to with your team for almost 9 years. So you're not drafting for what you might need next season. You're drafting for the best player for the next 9 years. People play exactly the same position, I don't know. But we drafted the 2 best available players who we happen to be very excited. Some guys had gone, but we took a point guard from Kentucky. I'll just give you an example about why I loved him. He didn't even start. He was the least heralded recruit at Kentucky until January. He moved in the starting lineup and just got better, 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 better. Just like I want USAFacts data to get better, 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 better. We also took a kid who actually finished his junior year, which is a big deal. But he was an unheralded recruit when he came into Boston College. Again, pushed himself. So these guys who actually can push themselves and improve, I was excited we had 2 guys like that.
Let me ask you a question about the league, Steve. How is it that the NBA has managed to avoid the problems that the NFL has had, say, for instance, with kneeling for the national anthem?
I think we have great leadership at the NBA, for sure. I can't imagine better leadership. I think on that one we had clear rules. You know, I would have supported our guys. I would have been okay with whatever they wanted to do, but the rule was clear that you need to stand for the national anthem, and if you don't, there's consequences, and our players all knew that. I think we had the benefit of the fact that the NFL had already gone. I think our players have better avenues to express themselves. You know, they don't wear helmets in our sport. When you wear a helmet, nobody sees you. To be a public figure is actually harder. You can be a public, there was a statement made by LeBron James, Chris Paul, Dwayne Wade, and I think Carmelo Anthony was the fourth one at the ESPY Awards year before last. And they got up and made a real political statement, which I thought was awesome, about what's going on in terms of violence and the issues with, you know, police and community. And that's great. We support, you know, our players are adults. They have a right to an opinion, and they have a right to participate in the political debate. If you wear a helmet, nobody's going to recognize you. I mean, I bet if you said most people in this room, how many football players would you recognize if they walked in the room? The answer would be a small number, and almost every one of them would be a quarterback. Just my guess. So.
All right, we are out of time, so we're going to have to leave it on that note. But what a great conversation, Steve. USAFacts, a little tech and a little basketball. Please join me in thanking Steve Ballmer.
Thank you, guys.
That's great. That was awesome.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you.